Have you ever wondered what it would have been like to be in Florida back in the early 1700s? I mean, not the vacation version we know today, but the time when pirates roamed the coast and European powers were fighting over every inch of this land. Yeah, wild stuff. Well, today we're going to talk about one of those moments that really shook things up. And I mean, literally shook things up. The British attack on St. Augustine in 1702. Ever heard of it? If not, no worries. We're going to dig right in and break it down for you. And even if you have heard of it, I bet there's a few things you didn't know, like how a little old fort by the name of Castillo de San Marcos ended up playing a huge role in how things went down. But hey, before we dive into all that cannon fire and chaos, grab yourself a cold drink, preferably sweet tea, and get comfy because we're about to take a trip back in time. Ready? Let's do this.
Welcome to Old Florida Now, where we uncover the rich history and hidden stories of the Sunshine State. Each episode will explore the people, places, and events that shaped Florida's past. Let's dive in.
All right, folks. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the 1702 British attack on St. Augustine, we got to set the stage a little bit, take a step back and look at what was going on in the world around that time. Because believe it or not, this wasn't just some isolated skirmish between a few colonies. Oh, no, this was part of a much bigger mess, a global chess game, or maybe more like a bar fight, if I'm being honest. So let's start with the big picture. This period of history is right smack in the middle of something called the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, if that name doesn't ring a bell, you might have heard of it as Queen Anne's War here in the colonies. Basically, Europe was a powder keg at the time. There were all these rivalries and alliances going on, and it all sort of spilled over into the New World. So who was fighting who, right? Well, you had Britain, the Netherlands, and Austria on one side, and they were up against France and Spain on the other. And oh man, these were not small-time beefs. This was like serious stuff. Everyone was jockeying for power, not just in Europe, but all over the globe. That means every little outpost, every colony, every inch of land could become a battleground. And that's kind of where things get interesting for us here in Florida, right? Because here we've got Spanish Florida, British Carolina to the north, and don't forget about French Louisiana out west, which just makes everything way more complicated than it needs to be. Seriously, it's like a three-way tug of war, and everybody's pulling in different directions. So let's start with Spanish Florida. St. Augustine had already been around for a hot minute by the time 1702 rolled around. We're talking 1565. See, this place is the oldest permanent European settlement in the U.S. It's a little crazy to think about, but back then, Florida wasn't all beaches and theme parks. It was mostly just wilderness, and the Spanish, they weren't just kicking back. They were busy building up a mission system, trying to convert the local native tribes to Christianity and keep them on their side, politically speaking. But of course, the British up in Carolina, they had their own ideas. Carolina had only been founded in like 1670. But the folks up there, they weren't just sitting still. They were eyeing Spanish Florida like, that could be ours. They wanted to expand their territory, control the trade routes, all that fun stuff. And that's where the tension starts to brew. And then, of course, you've got the French over in Louisiana kind of minding their own business, but also not really. They're making things even more of a headache for the British and the Spanish by just being there. It's like you've got these two neighbors fighting over the fence, and then here come the French with a lawn chair and popcorn ready to complicate things even more. So, by the time we get to 1702, it's basically this huge powder keg of colonial tension. Spain's hold on Florida was getting shaky, and the British were looking for any excuse to push south and take over. All this while Queen Anne's War is raging across the Atlantic. It's a lot to take in, but that's kind of the backdrop for the whole St. Augustine attack. It wasn't just a random raid. It was part of a much bigger global conflict. Anyway, that's the lay of the land, so to speak. All right, y'all. So let's talk about the heart of Spanish Florida, the one place that held it all together, St. Augustine. Now, this city was founded way back in 1565 by a guy named Pedro Menendez de Aviles. And get this, it's the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the U.S. Yeah, older than Jamestown, older than Plymouth. It's been around forever. Menendez landed here with a mission: kick the French out of Florida and secure Spain's claim. And boy, he did just that, wiping out the French at Fort Caroline before setting up camp in what he called San Augustine. Now, why here, right? Why'd they pick this spot? Well, St. Augustine had a solid harbor that was perfect for defending against attacks and controlling sea routes. Spain needed a foothold in the region, and this was it. But here's the thing. They weren't just chilling by the beach. The city got hit hard over the years, especially by pirates, like good old Sir Francis Drake, who torched the place in 1586. After that, the Spanish were like, all right, no more messing around. And they decided to build something that could really hold up. And that's where the Castillo de San Marcos comes in. They started construction in 1672 using this wild material called coquina, which is like compressed seashells and sand. It's not just any stone. It's soft but tough. And the crazy part, coquina actually absorbed cannonballs instead of shattering. So the fort was like this giant sponge that just took hit after hit and kept standing. The design of the fort was all about defense. It had this cool bastion system, which is a fancy way of saying there were angled walls with big old cannons pointing out in every direction. The whole setup was meant to keep the British or anyone else at bay, and it worked. Over the years, that fort became a real symbol of Spanish determination to hold on to Florida, no matter who was knocking at their door. So yeah, St. Augustine and its fort weren't just sitting pretty. They were a serious power player in the tug of war between Spain, Britain, and all the other big European powers looking to claim a piece of the New World. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the English ambitions, especially through one of the key figures, Governor James Moore. Now, Moore was an interesting guy, right? He wasn't born in Carolina. He actually came over from Ireland, but he really worked his way up in the colony's political world. By 1700, he found himself as governor of Carolina, but Moore wasn't just a politician. Oh no, this guy was all about expansion and personal gain. Some say he was looking for glory, while others point to his desire to undermine Spain's hold on Florida and, well, why not make a little money while he's at it? So one of the big motivations for Moore's actions was economic. Back in the day, the Carolinas were looking to control trade routes, but it wasn't just about crops or goods. No, the real money was in the Indian slave trade. Yeah, they were raiding Native American villages, capturing people, and selling them off to plantations in the Caribbean. It's not a pretty part of history, but it was a huge part of the economy back then. Now, Moore couldn't have done all this on his own. He formed alliances with powerful native tribes, particularly the Yamasee and the Creek nations. And these alliances weren't just one-sided deals. The Yamasee and Creek had their own motivations, whether it was getting better trade deals, gaining European weapons, or even using Moore's forces to deal with their own tribal enemies. So yeah, it's a complex give and take relationship. But these alliances over time also created a lot of tension, especially with rival tribes, which eventually exploded in conflicts like the Yamasee War a few years later. So while Moore was out there attacking Spanish Florida and trading in slaves, he was really pushing the boundaries of British control, and that's what set the stage for the big showdown at St. Augustine in 1702. But we'll get more into that in a bit. Before we get into the actual siege of St. Augustine, we got to talk about the lead up. Governor James Moore saw a big opportunity to expand Carolina's influence while taking down the Spanish stronghold in Florida. Moore wasn't some military mastermind or anything. He was really more of a politician and a businessman. But man, did he know how to rally people when he needed to. So here's the deal. Moore knew that attacking St. Augustine wasn't just about taking some land. It was about breaking Spanish control in the region. The thing is, he didn't just rush in without a plan. First off, he gathered intelligence on the Spanish defenses. Now, espionage back then wasn't like in the movies, no secret agents, but there were definitely scouts and informants. Moore had been keeping an eye on St. Augustine's defenses for a while, especially that big old Castillo de San Marcos, which was a beast to break into. Now, for an attack like this, Moore didn't go alone. He built an army, about 500 English colonists and 300 native allies, mostly from the Yamasee and Creek nations, but Moore needed their help to navigate through the wild Florida terrain and to bolster his forces. These guys knew the land better than anyone. By the time November 1702 rolled around, Moore was ready. His forces moved down the coast, attacking Spanish missions on the way, burning villages, and displacing hundreds of mission Indians. The destruction was brutal. The Spanish missions north of St. Augustine were some of the first to fall, and for the native people living there, it was a nightmare. Homes were destroyed, families scattered. As Moore's army got closer to St. Augustine, the Spanish knew what was coming. They fortified themselves inside Castillo de San Marcos, while Moore and his forces began surrounding the city, cutting off supply routes and torching everything they could. The tension was high, and it was just the beginning of what would become a drawn-out siege. All right, folks, let's get into it. The siege of St. Augustine in 1702. This was a huge moment in Florida's history where English forces, led by Governor James Moore, thought they could just roll in and take the city from the Spanish. But things didn't exactly go according to plan. So here's how it went down. In November of 1702, Moore and his forces arrive at St. Augustine with the idea that they could blockade the city by land and sea. He brought some small cannons and thought that'd be enough to break through the Spanish defenses. But here's the kicker. He didn't account for the coquina walls of the Castillo de San Marcos. This stuff, it's like ancient Florida magic or something. Cannonballs would hit the walls and just sort of sink in. It didn't crack, didn't shatter, just absorbed it. You can imagine how frustrating that was for the English soldiers trying to break in. Now, on the Spanish side, you've got Governor Joseph de Zuniga Zerda. He'd been in command at St. Augustine for a couple of years and knew exactly how to use the fort to his advantage. When word got to him that Moore was coming, he ordered the civilians to pack into the fort, almost 1,500 people in there, plus all their cattle. The place was packed, but Zuniga had enough supplies stashed away to hold out for a couple of months if needed. As for life inside the fort, I mean, it wasn't great. You've got soldiers and civilians all crammed together, rations starting to dwindle and disease spreading. Morale was low, but they knew that if they could just hang on, help might arrive from Cuba or one of Spain's other posts. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Moore was getting really frustrated. His small cannons weren't doing the trick, so he sent his deputy, Robert Daniel, to Jamaica for bigger artillery. Spoiler alert, the help from Jamaica never came. Things started to stall out. There were a few skirmishes, but the English just couldn't breach the fort. By December, Moore's men were deserting, supplies were running low, and morale was tanking. Moore tried everything, even sending a Yamasee couple into the fort pretending to be refugees to blow up the powder magazine, but Zuniga saw through the ruse. Finally, on December 28th, the Spanish got the break they needed. Now, let's get into the turning point of the whole 1702 siege. Things were looking rough for both sides. English forces had St. Augustine under siege for weeks, but they weren't exactly breaking down the doors of the Castillo de San Marcos. I mean, those coquina walls were basically like the superpower of the Spanish defense, absorbing cannon fire like it was nothing. But the English, they were running low on supplies, and morale was starting to dip hard. Then, just when things couldn't get any worse for Moore, something happened that flipped the whole situation on its head. On December 28th, out of the blue, sails appeared on the horizon, Spanish reinforcements from Havana. Talk about a bad day for Moore, right? This fleet wasn't just bringing extra firepower. They were cutting off the English supply lines, meaning Moore's men were basically stuck. Moore had a choice, dig in and keep trying, or retreat and save what he could. Well, he chose to retreat, but not before making a pretty dramatic move. He ordered his ships burned. Burned them to keep the Spanish from capturing them. And as a final act of frustration, he had the town outside the fort torched too. It was like one big, if we can't have it, neither can you moment. So Moore's forces had to hightail it back to Carolina, leaving St. Augustine intact. And let's just say it wasn't exactly a triumphant return home. The English had suffered heavy losses, and their native allies, like the Yamasee, were probably feeling a bit burned by how it all played out too. On the flip side, for the Spanish, it was a massive victory. yeah, they were running low on food and supplies in the fort, but the psychological boost of surviving the siege was huge. It reinforced their position in Florida and showed they weren't going to be taken down so easily by the English. All right, so let's talk about one of the tougher parts of this whole story, the impact on Native American tribes. I mean, it wasn't just the Europeans going at it. Native peoples were pulled right into the middle of all this, often with devastating consequences. So on the English side, Governor James Moore promised a lot to the tribes that allied with him, especially the Yamasee and the Creek. These tribes played a huge role in Moore's campaign, helping him attack Spanish missions and take captives along the way. But Moore wasn't just offering friendship. There was a lot of economic motivation here too. The English were deeply invested in the Indian slave trade, and Moore saw an opportunity to capture and sell native people into slavery for a quick buck. It's brutal, but that's how it was. And these promises, yeah, a lot of them went unfulfilled or came with a heavy price. Now, on the other side, the Spanish had long established alliances with other native tribes, and particularly the ones connected to their mission system, like the Timucua and the Apalachee. But those missions were targeted and pretty much wiped out by Moore's raids. Whole villages were burned, and native populations were either enslaved, displaced, or just wiped off the map. Many of these tribes were already dealing with disease and pressure from European expansion. So the attack just, well, it sped up their decline. What's really wild is how all this reshuffled alliances down the road. The devastation caused by Moore's attacks planted the seeds for something bigger. The Yamasee War in 1715. Yeah, the same tribes that fought alongside Moore eventually turned on the British when they realized they were being exploited. It's like you can only break so many promises before things blow up. So the human cost of the 1702 siege wasn't just about the Spanish and the English. It had long-term effects on native populations, cultures, and alliances that rippled through the region for years. Okay, folks, let's talk about what happened after the siege of St. Augustine. You might be thinking, well, Moore's siege was a bust, right? And yeah, it totally was. But the fallout, oh man, it rippled through both Carolina and Spain. First up, let's look at Governor James Moore. So this guy was aiming for glory, right? But after the siege, things didn't go as planned. Not only did he fail to take the Castillo de San Marcos, but he also racked up a ton of debt. I mean, the whole expedition was a massive financial disaster. The colonial government wasn't too thrilled either. He ended up having to resign not long after the siege in 1703. His political reputation, well, it never really recovered. Moore's legacy, kind of mixed. On one hand, he was known as a bold military leader, but this defeat, it put him in some serious hot water. Now, on the Spanish side of things, Governor Joseph de Zuniga Izerda, he was like, all right, we're not letting this happen again. The siege showed Spain that their defenses in Florida needed some serious shoring up. So what did they do? They doubled down, strengthening their fortifications and making sure they were better prepared for future attacks. I mean, they built more defenses, tightened up security, and made sure that Castillo de San Marcos was ready for anything. So, yeah, while Moore was trying to explain away his failure, the Spanish were fortifying their stronghold. This whole thing had lasting effects on both sides. It was a real turning point in how both the English and Spanish saw their hold on the region. It's kind of wild how those ripples just keep going. So after James Moore and his forces pulled back from St. Augustine, both sides took a long, hard look at what went down. First off, the Spanish, they realized that their fort, the Castillo de San Marcos, was way more solid than anyone thought. That coquina stone we talked about earlier, it just soaked up the English cannon fire. So one big takeaway for future military strategy was that maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to rely as much on like manpower. The fort was that strong, and that's a huge lesson in siege warfare. It's not always about having more guys. Sometimes it's about having better defenses. Now, for the British, the siege might have ended in a retreat, but it got them thinking too, especially when it came to future conflicts. You know how they say the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Well, after this whole mess, there was a lot more focus on strengthening colonial defenses and planning for future attacks. This siege was like, hey, the Spanish are still tough, so we got to be ready for round two. That mindset laid some of the groundwork for later conflicts. You could say it was a spark that helped lead to things like the War of Jenkins' Ear. Yeah, that's a real thing. And other colonial squabbles. And here's where things get really interesting. Fast forward a bit, and we see the British founding Georgia in 1733. And guess why they did that? Yup, it was a buffer colony. Georgia was basically a big keep out sign between British South Carolina and Spanish Florida. It was like, we don't want another St. Augustine situation, so let's put some space between us and them. The siege might not have gone the way the English wanted, but it definitely made them like rethink how they were going to handle their southern border moving forward. So even though this siege didn't end in a victory for the English, it was kind of like a reality check. It shaped military and colonial policies on both sides and set the stage for future conflicts. Not exactly what Moore had in mind, I'm sure, but hey, that's the nature of unintended consequences, right? All right, y'all. So let's take a second to zoom out and look at this whole siege from a few different angles, because, there's always more than one side to every story, and this one's no different. So let's break down the good, the bad, and well, the ugly, depending on who you ask. First up, let's start with the Spanish. From their perspective, this whole thing was honestly kind of a triumph. They managed to hold off the British, again, thanks to Castillo de San Marcos. And let's just face it, a little help from Havana. That fort was solid. The Spanish knew it could take a beating, and they were right. I mean, think about it. Moore and his guys threw everything at that thing, and it just soaked it all up. So in a way, this was a huge win for Spanish pride. It really cemented their faith in their fortifications. Like, yeah, we built something that can't be knocked down easily. So for them, huge confidence boost. Now, from the English side, this was rough. I mean, they thought they could stroll in, take St. Augustine, and, pat themselves on the back. But what happened instead? Moore got stuck in a siege. Supplies ran low. His troops started bailing. And then to top it off, the Spanish fleet shows up from Havana, and bam, he's got to call it quits. That's a hard pill to swallow. But weirdly enough, even though it was a failure, it kind of lit a fire under the English. They were like, all right, we didn't get St. Augustine, but that doesn't mean we're done. In fact, this whole mess probably influenced the push to found Georgia. Later on, they figured if they couldn't knock out the Spanish right away, they'd at least build a buffer zone, Now, for the Native Americans caught in the middle, man, this was just brutal. The English had their allies, the Yamasee Creek, and the Spanish had theirs. But for the native tribes involved, this wasn't their fight. And yet they ended up losing big. Villages were burned, missions destroyed, people displaced. It was devastating. And this is the start of a shift for a lot of these tribes leading up to things like the Yamasee War not long after. So, yeah, for them, it's not a story of triumph or failure. It's a story of loss, but also of resilience. They adapted, but man, the cost was high. And then we get to the bigger question, the moral one, I guess you could say, like, was any of this worth it? You've got these big European powers fighting over land that honestly wasn't even theirs to begin with, and who paid the price? The native populations, the settlers caught in the crossfire. And it's one of those things where, sure, on a map it looks like progress, but on the ground there's a whole lot of pain and destruction. So depending on how you look at it, this siege, it's got different meanings. Triumph for some, failure for others, and for a lot of people, just a reminder of how messy and painful colonial ambition can be. Let's fast forward a bit, because the legacy of the siege of St. Augustine, well, it didn't just end in the 1702. No, the echoes of that siege still ripple through today, and we see it every time we visit Castillo de San Marcos. Now, the fort itself is a national monument, like officially designated by the U.S. government. And get this, it's the oldest masonry fort in the continental U.S. It's pretty wild that this structure, built from seashells and sand, has stood the test of time, right? The fort's coquina walls still hold strong, and it's a constant reminder of the resilience of this place. They've done some incredible archaeological work around the site over the years too, uncovering all kinds of artifacts that give us a deeper understanding of what life was like during the siege. Every dig seems to uncover something new, bits of pottery, old weapons, even personal items that make you wonder about the stories of the people who lived through it all. Now, beyond just the physical preservation, there's this huge educational importance attached to the fort. I mean, it's one thing to read about colonial conflicts in a textbook, but it's another thing, it's entirely to stand in front of those towering walls and really grasp the complexities of that era. Teaching this history, warts and all, is super important, right? It helps us understand how these colonial struggles shaped not just Florida, but honestly, all of America. And then there's the cultural side of things. St. Augustine today really leans into its history, and it's become a big part of the city's identity. They've got annual reenactments of the siege where people dress up and recreate the events of 1702. It's a huge draw for tourists and history buffs alike. It's like the past comes to life right in front of you. You know, it's one thing to read about Governor Moore trying and failing to break through the fort's defenses, but it's another to see cannons firing and soldiers marching through the streets. So it's a cool way for people to connect with this piece of history in a real visceral way. So yeah, from the preservation of Castillo de San Marcos to the way St. Augustine celebrates its past today, the legacy of that siege is still very much alive. It's a reminder of the resilience, the conflicts, and the stories that shape this place. And it shows us that history isn't just something that happened. It's something we live with every day. Sorry to get a little philosophical. All right, folks, we've covered quite the journey today, huh? From Governor Moore's ambitions to the resilience of St. Augustine's fort and the impact on native tribes. This 1702 siege was more than just a clash between Spain and Britain. It was a defining moment for so many different groups. The Spanish defending their territory, the English pushing for expansion, and of course, the native tribes caught in the crossfire. Now, to recap, the siege really showed off the strength of Castillo de San Marcos, right? I mean, the fort was practically invincible thanks to that coquina stone. It didn't crack under pressure, literally. The English threw everything they had at it, but in the end, it was Moore who had to retreat. And on the bigger picture, this conflict set the stage for more tension, more war, and even played a part in the founding of Georgia as a buffer colony. But if we look beyond the cannons and sieges, there's something more to the story. You know, it's a story of resilience, so of people and cultures fighting to hold on to what's theirs. And honestly, it's that mix of ambition, struggle, and survival that's kind of woven into the very fabric of Florida's history. And we still see that today in St. Augustine, right? It's this living, breathing reminder of the past. So here's what I think. The 1702 attack on St. Augustine is more than a tale of cannons and sieges. It's a story of resilience, ambition, and the intricate tapestry of cultures that have shaped Florida. It's a reminder of how history isn't just about battles. It's about the people caught up in it, the places that endure, and the legacies that get passed down. Now, if you haven't already, I highly recommend taking a trip to St. Augustine, walk through the streets, visit the Castillo de San Marcos. It's like stepping back in time. You really get a sense of how history shaped not just Florida, but the entire region. And hey, if you do, send me your thoughts or pics on social media. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for tuning in today. And don't forget to follow Old Florida Now for more deep dives into our state's wild history. Catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Old Florida Now. Stay tuned for more stories from the Sunshine State's past. Until next time.